Welcome to another episode of Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and the episode is brought to you today by our featured patron, Lindsay. Lindsay, you're awesome. Thanks for being a patron.
Thank you for being a longtime patron, too.
This week we are talking about the Osborne Company and the Osborne Effect. Have you heard of the Osborne Effect, Tony?
I have not, actually.
Okay, well, we're going back to like the early 1980s with this episode, and the Osborne Corporation had the Osborne One. And the Osborne One is what was called, in the parlance of the day, a luggable computer.
Luggable is a great term for this. I've seen them at garage sales before, and I almost picked it up just because it's like little tiny 4-inch screen, giant keyboard, probably like 60 pounds. It was a monster.
So the form factor of the luggable computer, for those of you who aren't picturing this in your head, is imagine like a full-size computer tower, right? Like the box that is your computer that's not the monitor part. Imagine that with the handle on the top, and then the front of it like folds off, and inside of it is a screen and like a floppy disk drive, and then the part that folded off is the keyboard. That's what a luggable computer was. And it was what we had before we had laptops. When people wanted to make computers portable, we didn't have anywhere near the technology shrinkage to be able to put it in like a flat form factor. So we had these giant things that you would just kind of put in your car trunk and maybe take to your hotel if you were a salesman or someone who was tripping around the world and could afford to have one of these sort of weird things to write on maybe. They were a really interesting artifact of the time. They were also sometimes called lunchbox computers.
That is quite the lunch. Like, you can bring a full-on feast.
Yeah. And the Osborne One was actually doing really well as a product. It had taken over the market because it had great quality and a real low price. At the time, computers were super expensive, so this thing was retailing at around $1,700, and that was at the low end of the price scale, and it came bundled with a bunch of software. Now, today, coming bundled with software is sort of a curse, right? We've got the bloatware, and that's annoying, and nobody likes to have like, oh, they installed Candy Crush on my computer. That's wonderful. Okay, but this was actually like a huge selling point because software was very expensive, much like the computers at the time, and the fact that the Osborne came with an advertised $1,500 worth of software in addition to the hardware at no extra charge really put it head and shoulders above the competition. But the computer market in the 1980s was moving at an incredible rate. The Osborne Corporation knew they needed something new to keep up with this evolution. So they started work on what would become the Osborne Executive. And the Osborne Executive was a remarkable piece of hardware for the time. Physically, it had a larger screen than the Osborne One, but the improvements weren't just physical and in the form factor. It also had a feature where it could read files that had been written by non-Osborne computers. And that doesn't sound all that exciting today because we have sort of this generalized ecosystem where you're either a Mac or a PC. And even if you have one of those two types of computers, you can probably still find a way to share the files over to the other one. But at the time, computer files, like not just the programs, right, but the actual way that files were written were essentially completely proprietary to every new system that came out.
That just sounds like such a mess. It's like you have weird issues between like sending a text from Android to Apple if you're trying to send a location and it becomes a giant paragraph of crap. But for the most part, everything else works.
Right, so the Osborne was revolutionary because it couldn't just read Osborne files. It could read files from like 4 other popular computers of the time, which meant like this thing was really going to be useful to your typical executive type.
Yeah, I imagine so many businesses were like, we don't have to like solely buy into one company, just buy all of these now.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that made this computer special was that it could emulate several different brands of what were called terminals at the time. Now, this was before the internet happened, but there were networks, let's say, of computers that you could dial into from what would essentially just be a monitor and a keyboard, and then you would stream their information to your computer. To use the terminology of today, they didn't call it streaming back then, but that's essentially what it was. And so the Osborne could emulate one of these terminal things and hook up to what was somewhat like an early version of the internet.
So it's like just a telnet thing, just send like the basic data, probably computer to computer directly.
It would be more like you have a centralized big computer that can do big computing, and you just send keystrokes to it and it sends back what letters should be displayed on the screen.
Oh, I see what you're saying now.
So you don't have any localized computer hardware. It's all offloaded off screen in the centralized location. It was, again, to use a modern term that I don't think was around at the time, it was computing in the cloud. So the Osborne Executive was clearly an upgrade over the Osborne 1. But it's important to remember that at the time that they were developing this, the founder of this company, Adam Osborne, wasn't trying to pitch it as a replacement. He fully intended to continue carrying the Osborne 1, and there would be people who would get plenty of use out of that. They were going to continue supporting it. It was still going to be useful for a lot of stuff. But then if you were the power user, you could get the Osborne Executive and do all the extra stuff it would let you do. But even with this in mind, Adam Osborne knew that he needed to manage this launch very carefully. So in the months leading up to the release of the Osborne Executive, Adam Osborne starts giving interviews to reporters and talking about the great new computer that they have coming called the Osborne Executive. And he says to these reporters at the time, listen, it's not coming out till later. It's going to come out in the late spring. He's sort of giving these in the early part of the year, letting people get in on the scoop, but asking them, hey, can you keep this under wraps until the computer is actually about to come out so that we can have this big push of media? And that was a good idea.
Yeah, it's like you've got to manage that hype so carefully whenever you're still trying to sell the old thing.
And this is what happened. Someone let the cat out of the bag. More than a month before the Osborne Executive was going to hit store shelves, the store owners found out through the grapevine that the Osborne Executive was coming and immediately stopped ordering the Osborne 1. They just let that shelf space expire because they said, listen, Osborne Executive coming down the pike, gonna be better, gonna be bigger, gonna be more expensive. We want it. We want to have room for it. That's gonna be our new top of the line luggable computer. And the revenue stream from the Osborne 1 just completely dries up. And you're talking about a company that's still relatively small. I mean, almost everybody at this point in computing is relatively small, except for maybe IBM and possibly Apple, who kind of has some experience under their belt at this point. But everybody else is sort of scrapping around trying to get something going out of almost nothing. And when this revenue stream dries up, it hits Osborne hard. And it hits them hard enough that by the time the Osborne Executive comes out, they are in some serious financial trouble. And that is where the story typically ends, Tony. This is the popular version of the story of something called the Osborne Effect, which is, in essence, don't announce your new released hardware way too early, because if you do, people will stop being excited about the old hardware and you won't be able to sell any of that. And once the new hardware gets there, they'll be disappointed and you will have shot yourself in the foot. However, as often happens when we're researching these bad ideas, I found that there's more to it than that. That's not actually the end of the story, because there's a reason that the Osborne Executive, when it did come out, actually didn't capture the part of the market that they thought it would. I mean, remember, all of these guys got excited about the Osborne Executive. They said, hey, look, the Osborne 1 we're getting rid of. Osborne has a real tough time for like a month. And then eventually the Osborne Executive comes out. That should have been, okay, fine, we can breathe now. People are buying the Osborne Executive. But they didn't.
So why didn't they buy the Executive whenever like the other model came out? It's like you only had a month lag time. It would suck to lose your revenues, but why did they hate on the new model?
Well, it turns out Osborne hit something called competition, Tony. Osborne had been the budget leader in the luggable computer world, but just as they're releasing the Osborne Executive, there's a new computer company that shows up on the scene called K-Pro. And K-Pro was releasing the K-Pro 2. Now, fun fact about the K-Pro 2, it is not exactly preceded by the K-Pro 1. There's like a prototype version called the K-Comp, but it's essentially exactly the same as the K-Pro 2 with just a slightly different form factor. They called it the K-Pro 2 because Apple II was so popular at the time, and they wanted to get in on that 2 action that people were so excited about.
I mean, if there's anything that Windows and these other companies are showing, it's that the numbers don't really matter. We'll just skip the ones we don't want. It's like there was no Windows 9.
Yes, they're way ahead on the curve on this.
Yeah.
Of just slapping a number on it that makes you feel good. And compared to the Osborne Executive, the K-Pro was... I have written down industrial and simple, Tony, but really the word that I want to use is ugly. All of these computers from the 1980s are relatively ugly for the most part. But the Osborne Executive had some kind of form factor. You know, they were trying for something to sort of look nice and elegant and cool. If you look at a picture of the K-Pro, it's just a big metal box with the front that comes off. Like, there's nothing more to it. It looks like something you would find in a factory somewhere. And honestly, I think that kind of became part of its appeal. There was this perception that it was more durable, and if you're going to have a computer that you're toting around with you and, you know, putting in the trunk of your car or carrying on a plane, you don't want to be worried that it's going to break if somebody throws it weird. And so the K-Pro has a leg up there.
Yeah, I just Googled it, and it looks kind of like a Fallout terminal type computer. It's sturdy, it's simple, it's like alternative to like modern history, all sorts of other stuff.
This is a complete sidebar, but
yes,
there's a subreddit about like old computers that I really enjoy. It's called Retro Battle Stations, and for like a month, because someone posted, hey, it looks like a computer from Fallout, everybody was just posting any picture of an old computer they had and saying, hey, it just looks like that computer from Fallout, huh? That's a joke that me and like 2 other people who listen to this podcast might get, but I enjoyed the fact that you went right for the old computers look like stuff from Fallout.
Oh, I mean, this one, like, it's because the screen is exactly shaped as the size of a Pip-Boy screen. That's why I went for that.
That's fair. The other thing that the K-Pro had over the Osborne 1 and Executive was that its screen was bigger. The Osborne 1 had a 5-inch screen, and the Osborne Executive had upgraded to a 7-inch screen. I know.
Whole 7 inches.
The decadence is off the chain.
I mean, if we're comparing it to last week's episode, like 5 to 7 inches can make a difference.
But the K-Pro, hold on to your hat, Tony, had a 9-inch screen.
Holy crap.
Right. Like, what are you even smoking? 9 inches? That's amazing.
Yeah, how are you going to even take that on an airplane?
And on top of that, the biggest killer of the Osborne Executive was that the K-Pro was cheaper. It was $200 cheaper than the Osborne 1 was at the release, and the Osborne Executive was even more expensive. K-Pro was the clear budget choice, and people flocked to it. People were very price conscious in the computer world even back then, even despite the fact that they were super expensive, right? The fact that this thing didn't do everything that the Executive would do didn't deter people from being excited about it being a couple $100 cheaper. There might have been some technical reasons why you would have gone for the Osborne, but for the sort of average computer buyer, the K-Pro was the clear winner between any of these Osborne computers, and so the K-Pro comes in and just smashes their sales.
Yeah. And whenever the Osborne company's trying to be that affordable, luggable computer and they get beat out by that big of a percentage, that's a pretty huge number. Especially back in the, like, what was this? You said early or late
Early
80s?
80s. This
Early
whole story
80s?
takes place between roughly 1980 and 1985. Is the whole arc of the Osborne Computer Company. There might have been some stuff happening in 1979, but like this is really about 5 years of history of them. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, competition, like maybe the Osborne Company didn't have a real good understanding of what the market would bear. Where is the real bad idea here? And that's what's coming up next, Tony, because the Osborne Corporation is struggling, right? They're getting their butt kicked by K-Pro. They need sales to come back, and things are about to get worse because someone in upper management at Osborne looks around the factory and they think, man, things are going bad for us. We're not selling these Osborne executives like we want. We got to get some money. What is this over here in these boxes? Why, it's a bunch of old Osborne 1 motherboards. You know what we could do with those? We could slap on a monitor and a keyboard and a case and make more Osbornes, right? We've got all these things. We can just make more Osborne 1s. Those sold okay. And we've already got 15% of the parts. Let's just make some.
All right. What happens after that? Old technology that's already out of date?
Well, the problem was that by this time, the Osborne 1 had been discontinued from production. And the company that made the case for the Osborne 1 to fit in had destroyed the mold. So to get this $150,000 worth of motherboards sold as completed computers, the Osborne company had to have them remake the mold, have them cast a bunch of new cases, buy more screens, buy more keyboards, put all this stuff together. And in the end, at this time when they're incredibly weak because of the competition, because of the Osborne Effect, because of all of these things that have happened, they end up spending $2 million in order to save $150,000 worth of hardware.
That's such a terrible, horrible, horrible idea.
It's so relatable, though. I mean, it's so hard to throw stuff away, right? Like, you see this stuff sitting around and you think, man, this is $150,000 worth of computer hardware right here. Why don't we do something with this? It's just free money. But that's the sunk cost fallacy singing you its siren song, because you're throwing good money after bad, and you do end up with what ends up being the end of the Osborne company. I don't know that any single one of these problems is what sank Osborne. I know that they seem to have been a good company, at least as far as the hardware that they were making. They had some really smart decisions, and if they had been able to weather one or two of these mistakes or market problems, they might have made it through. But the combination of all three sort of happening in a row sinks them, and they go out of business in 1985. They close their doors forever. There's like a Norwegian knockoff computer company that bought the name, so you can still buy an Osborne computer if you want, but it has nothing to do with any of the people involved in this story.
And it's also not something that I've heard of in any time, so it's not exactly a giant thriving company.
But that is it. That is the bad idea for this week. Starting off, don't announce your product too early, which admittedly, by the way, despite the fact that that did happen and it hurt them, it was something that they actually were trying to avoid. Adam Osborne did not go out and run his mouth like nonstop to everybody about his new computer. It just so happened that the word got out without him running his mouth nonstop, and that kind of hit them hard. Then, do your market research, know what your competition is coming up with, know what the public wants, and don't throw good money after bad. Those are the lessons we can learn from the Osborne Computer Company. And my favorite lesson, which I learn over and over on this show, is that stories are always more complicated than you expect. Because the first part of the story is what normally gets told as sort of, this is why Osborne failed. And there's always a few more extra details that people leave off because that doesn't make necessarily for the most compelling story that you can tell in 60 seconds or less.
I don't know. I feel like the after story was more interesting than the pre-story. Like once they end up like just sinking their last bit of money in their death throes into something that's just a really, really bad idea for outdated technology, it's just that seems like murder from the moment they came up with the idea. Like, that's just the way you bury your company.
It was definitely the last nail in the coffin. And that is the last thing that we have to say about the Osborne Effect and the Osborne Corporation. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you like this, don't forget to leave a like if you're over there on YouTube. Send us a message if you are listening on the sort of whatever podcast audio app you're listening on. We would love to get those at Human Echoes on Twitter. And also, if you have bad ideas, you can send them to that Twitter I just mentioned or over to badideashow@gmail.com. We would love to hear any bad ideas you guys have to suggest, and we will see you guys next week with another one. Take care, y'all.
Bye, everybody.